So beyond just our social roles, our identity also encompasses our tastes and our preferences, and the things that you prefer and want, your dispositions, that are very much linked to the roles we end up playing, but to some degree are also distinct. Perhaps the sociologist who has written the most about this is Pierre Bourdieu, French sociologist, and he has this theory of the habitus. This is a term that he uses, the habitus. And this is our embodied, meaning it's in our being, it's in our body, it's physical, but it's also socialized, right? So it's the embodied set of dispositions, preferences, and tastes that shape our desires and our behaviors. So this is, like I said, while it is something physical we carry around with us, it is also something that was socialized. So our tastes, our preferences, they come from somewhere, right? They're not all just hardwired in our genetics or something. If you like sushi, you were at some point socialized to value sushi as a potentially, good way to go have dinner on a Friday night or something. And for someone else, the thought of raw fish might literally be nauseating to them, right? And so socialization plays a significant role into our preferences and tastes, even though over time they seem pretty set and can feel very much like these just, permanent parts of our personality that nobody taught us, but they're just these, expressions of some inner self. But Pierre Bourdieu argues that we develop this habitus, that it's socialized in us. And there's a couple of unique features of this habitus that Bourdieu studied. One, it is highly class conditioned, meaning your class background, your upper class, middle class, working class, poor, and so forth. That plays a significant role into what your tastes end up being, right? So this could be food. This could be types of jobs that you want, kinds of entertainment that you prefer, environments you like to be in, the kinds of relationships that you want to have. So take like food or something, right? So are there some foods that are considered classy, bougie, right, compared to others? Somebody who's wealthy might not see themselves eating at a certain kind of fast food restaurant. Whereas somebody who's from a lower class might think that, a totally rare steak or caviar or something is disgusting. Now, in American culture, this isn't always as determinate because American culture has what we call an omnicultural approach to consumption based by class. Now, certainly those with more money consume more and more expensive things. But we have less of a strict high culture, low culture binary, like you'll find in some other times and places, meaning that the wealthiest among us might still wear a hoodie, might still, Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest investors in America, still eats at McDonald's every day. So that might not be as obvious, but perhaps it becomes more clear when we think of something like career preference. Right? So I study a lot of that. I'm a sociologist of work and occupations and careers. To pursue a career, we have to know that we want that kind of career. First, we have to be aware that it even exists. And so certainly the range of possible career opportunities that you grow up seeing as possible differs based on your class background. So A, awareness, but B, of the career, but B, the desirability. Is that the kind of career that someone like you does? Did you know anyone in your life or world that did that career? You're very unlikely to want something or view something as desirable that you've never actually seen around you in practice. Now, maybe you have a loose aspiration to things you see on TV or in social media. And those can be kind of like fantasies, and not that some people can't pursue those and maybe even achieve them, but most of us will end up wanting, desiring, and thinking are good matches for us, career paths that we've seen on display in our lives at some point. Linked to this class conditioning is also prospects, the plausibility, the probability of something happening. So if something seems way out of your league, career-wise, relationship-wise, where you want to live, your habitus will often, it can actually be somewhat protective, right? Because it makes it so that you don't always desire things that you're very unlikely to ever get, right? So not many of us actually spend much time being bummed out that we're not billionaires, right? Or that we're not, we may not aspire to, or even think it sounds desirable to become a U.S. senator, right? Or an Olympic gold athlete. Now, it's one thing to, think of like, oh, that could be neat, or maybe I'd, fantasize about what we'd do if we were in that situation. But, you probably aren't going to lose sleep wrestling with whether or not you should be curating your life towards the possibility of becoming a senator. Now, if you grew up, in an environment where your parent or close family member or friend or something was a U.S. senator, then you might actually spend some time, some anxiety being like, well, should I try to go this route or not? Am I giving up if I don't, really shoot for that? Maybe trying to be some big tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley might sound neat, but if that's just not the reality you were a part of, you don't really lose any sleep deciding that that's not for you, right? And so it is class conditioned, but sometimes that's based on a kind of realistic, even if it's subconscious, idea that certain things are more probable than not. You're more likely to desire something that seems within your grasp, right? Or take like the kind of romantic partner you're shopping for. You have this list of things. And when you look at those things, whether that's their income or their social status or their level of physical attractiveness or, so on and so forth, you probably have a set of desires or preferences from them within a relatively close range to who you are. And now on one hand, our habitus then can become constricting. It can help reinforce the status quo because whether we're talking careers or marriage markets or, what have you, people will tend to only prefer things that were from their same class position or to really go after things from their same class conditioning. But it also has a kind of psychological protective effect of not having us carry around a bunch of guilt for not pursuing or achieving things that we were very unlikely ever to have a chance to pursue and successfully attain. So one other thing that the habitus does, or a way that it operates, is that you can think of it as a bridge between two other words that sound pretty similar, and that is your habitat and your habits, right? So your habitat is literally your environment. That could be a geospatial physical environment or a social context environment. And then your habits are the routines you do, the daily kind of sets of activities that you do over and over and over again. Your morning routine or the routes you drive, just the way you interact with the people, the handful of people that you see most on a given day. So you have a habitat, an environment, both social and physical, that you're in, and a set of habits that you do. And those habits are helpful, right? The human brain tends to routinize our behavior by default because it takes less cognitive energy, right? If every single time you woke up, it was this novel experience to decide what to do next. Should I brush my teeth today? What should I wear? What should I, where should I go? How should I spend my day? Like, it would be kind of overwhelming. We are actually more efficient. Now, at the risk of, life can become a little boring and a little, routine if we're always following the same routine. So a little novelty, a little change, a little variety is sometimes fun. But if all you had was novelty and variety, right? If you never got to eat the same food twice, that actually would become quite chaotic, quite overwhelming, right? It's related to the idea of culture shock. If you get plopped down into a culture where everything is new and different, it's hard to feel like you're in a safe habitat, right? So that's habitat. Your habits, your routines don't match that habitat, and so it creates stress. And that stress can actually be bad for your immune system. It increases your cortisol levels, a kind of stress hormone. So our brains, for good reason, evolutionarily adapted, like routines, like building patterns of behavior, because it makes it so that there's more brain power reserved for other things, such as when we do come up on a novel experience, and we can try to make the most of those, hopefully. So the habitus, your embodied set of dispositions, preferences, and tastes, is the bridge that tries to match your habits, your social routines and behavioral routines, with your habitat, both physical and social context. And when the habitus is doing a good job, then the things you want and prefer, both in, food, activities, career paths, relationships, they match well with the environment you're in, and you're more likely to thrive. This is related to socialization in that way. You're more likely to be a productive, thriving member of your society because what you feel like your default wishes are match the things that would help you do well where you actually are. Now, there's a gazillion movies and stories and books and whatever about habitus failing to do this or mismatch between habits and habitat, right? So I remember Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as a kid, right? So here's a kid raised in the inner city on the streets, and then because he's getting in trouble, he gets shipped off to his aunt and uncle's house in Bel-Air, this real bougie, rich, community. And so it's this comedy with Will Smith, but it's all about the hijinks that follow from a kind of habitat and habits mismatch. His habitus was not ideally designed to put him there. Now, what's fun in that story is that sometimes he's totally out of sync with the environment, and that gets him into kind of social faux pas and sometimes actual trouble. But then occasionally you find out that some of his habits, he's really good at basketball, or he can be more assertive, actually have they become these kind of hidden strengths that he is able to use well in this new environment. And that's totally possible. I mean, humans are adaptable, right? So as we talked about, we use institutions for instincts. It means that we are not totally limited to one kind of habitat, like a lot of animals are. You pull them out of that habitat, that ecosystem, they won't survive, right? But humans are adaptable, often because of the institutions we build. But we can, potentially, our habitus can change a little bit, can match some things from our habits to a different habitat. Now, most of us will move habitats over life, but not in radically different ways, right? When you move from your grade school to your middle school, to your high school, to your college, to your workplace, or from one community to another community to follow a job or something like that, from one friend circle to another, they're different. And so in your mind, they feel like these, big departures or shifts in chapters of your life. From single to dating to being married or what have you, back to divorce again, whatever. And even though they feel pretty significant, most people don't end up in radically different habitats. The kinds of personality traits you look for in a friend group, or the kinds of institutional ways in which you find friends, is it at work, is it at school, is it at church, whatever, they tend to be somewhat similar. Right? The schools you go to, usually you're not going from a super, poor, dangerous, resource-starving school environment to, Harvard or something. Now, some people experience these big shifts, but most of us will end up at a environment relatively similar to the one before. And so we have this experience of our life being full of change. But a lot of our dispositions and habits, and they can be consistent for a long time in our life because our social settings our habitats aren't actually changing as much as in our minds that we might perceive them as changing just because it's a new location or a new set of people we're interacting with. There might be a lot of parallels between the previous and the current, and then the future versions of that. So there are times where we have a mismatch. And when we have mismatch, if our habits are not aligned with what helps a person do well in that habitat, right? If the habitus is not able to shift your desires and preferences in a way to bridge those, then there's a high likelihood that you won't thrive in that setting. Maybe you'll find yourself underemployed, lonely. There's a variety of, you can brainstorm all the possible outcomes, of negative outcomes of habitat-habit mismatch. But it's the habitus that is trying to match those. And so lastly with that, just a couple final points. And one is that, the habitus is quite stable, but it is not immutable. It can be changed. And I already kind of touched on that. But once you move out of primary socialization into secondary socialization, a lot of your preferences are pretty set. And because you're unlikely to move from one habitat to another that is radically different, one social context to another that's radically different, because of that, there's this feeling that people don't really change. But maybe you do. Maybe you change a couple percent a year. But over time, it's that can add up to a pretty big amount. But year to year, it looks like people are pretty stable, and there's probably benefit to that. How chaotic would it be if every relationship in your life, was like a totally different person year to year. So there is some probably social benefit to the stability that comes from our habitus being pretty stabilized, consistent. But that said, while it is somewhat crystallized, it is not destiny, right? You can evolve, you can adapt to have different tastes, different preferences. Some people would say, oh, it's easier to have your habitus adapt to a higher income than a lower income. And I think that that's probably true, but because of the social location most of us are in America, which is a capitalist, largely materialistic environment. So you're already being exposed to wealthier lifestyles on TV and in movies and on your social media influencers. So if you find yourself suddenly coming into more wealth later in life, it's not completely foreign to start to prefer some of those things. But you could imagine a culture or society where it is highly favored and you get a lot of status from a kind of simple lifestyle. And so it may not always be the case that it's easier for your habitus to adapt to higher level lifestyles. But in the United States, it's probably logical that could be the case rather than being socially downwardly mobile. And then lastly, habitus is not just internal tastes and preferences. It actually has an impact on our body. So as I said, it is embodied. And so it can influence things like, the accent you have when you talk and how expressive you are. Do you talk with your hands a lot, right? There's cultural components in that. And if you're really loud and a close talker and vivacious, use your hands, that set of habits might match a habitat where that is accepted. And if you're not kind of assertive like that, boisterous, whatever, you don't get heard. But you can imagine another environment where people are like, whoa, this person's aggressive. The way you walk, like the gait of your body, is influenced by your habitus. Certainly there's gender and class and racial components into that. Digestion, the kinds of foods that are appealing to you versus nauseating. On one sense you might think like, well, food is food. It should be digestible to all people, but one person can have their mouth watering for some delicacy, and another person looks at someone eating that and turns their stomach. So even sort of our digestive components, the objects of sexual arousal. I mean, those are very physical, and yet they're highly influenced by habitus. So there's a lot of or take like the ability to play the piano, a musical instrument. Some people are type. Right, I don't have to look at the letters when I type. I couldn't even tell you the order of the letters. I just can feel it because I've been doing it so long. But that's habitus. It gets into your body, right? It helps with the kind of routine behaviors. And I type a lot. And so that's a match for my habitat because my job requires it and my lifestyle requires it. You know what I don't know how to do? Change the oil in my car. Right now, that might seem pretty standard in some environments, but I've never had a need to. And so it's never been something that matters that I don't know how to do. End with, your identity is not just your social roles. It certainly includes the sum total of your social roles, but it also includes your tastes, habits, preferences, the things you want. And the habitus is the term we use to talk about where those come from and the task it's fulfilling to match your habits with your habitat.